ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Fluffenhammer. You will notice there is no dramatic reading at the beginning of this episode because that is the bag of my usual co-host, Adam, who I'm afraid is not with us this evening. Oh, no. He's been banished back to the warp, I'm afraid. Yes, I'm afraid that the Grey Knights did discover his nefarious and occult activities, and his physical form has been utterly annihilated. He is now a formless entity in the depths of the realms of chaos, and it will take him a little while to reform, so until then, you are stuck with me, I'm afraid. By the way, on that note, if any of you would like to lend your flesh to his resurgence, that would be most appreciated. He promises to have it back to you in reasonable condition. There may be one or two extra tentacles, maybe a horn here or there, a few extra eyes about the place, but that's all well and good. But I am not alone here. No. My own occult rituals have gone very, very well, and I have dragged something kicking and screaming from the depths of the warp. I don't quite know what it will do. But my friend Tom is here with me. Tom, hello!
Hello, George. Very good to be here.
Brilliant. And we've been trying, actually, to get Tom on the podcast for a very, very long while. I mean, one of the things we love to do on this podcast, Tom, we've had so many different people who have come at the hobby from so many diverse perspectives, and that's kind of what we look for. It's been fascinating. I mean, I don't know whether have you listened to any of the podcasts, the Games Workshop style podcasts out there?
I haven't, no. I'll get to that for reasons I can discuss later, but it's very exciting to hear your enthusiasm and be able to share a little bit of why I am a Games Workshop fan.
Brilliant. I mean, that's really what inspired this whole podcast. Adam and I started it because we were out of the hobby for a long time. It's what most people who are in the Fluffenhammer community call the dark days of Games Workshop, which we tend to sort of draw a veil over or allude to obliquely. We were out of the hobby for a long time, and then Games Workshop started doing stuff. They started to do really good stuff around, I think it was sort of around the turn of 2016. They started to bring out the specialty games again. They started to bring out board games again. They started to rejuvenate the armies that had been neglected, and suddenly they were responding to the fan base. You know, you had an online presence, you started to have Facebook pages, there's Warhammer Community, which is an entire online community, there's Warhammer TV, where they have podcasts and they have online games and stuff like that. And suddenly, we couldn't resist. You know what did it for me, more than anything?
What's that?
The Thousand Suns.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
It was where... Have you seen them? Have you seen the more recent Thousand Suns?
Oh, yes, and I can say I love them from my experience of being stuck in a remote cabin in Scotland with a friend of mine about 10 years ago painting his original Thousand Sun army.
Oh, my God. No, all metal.
Yes, very resemblance of the inside of a Toblerone bar. In terms of both stance and general dimension, and after being stuck inside in a midge-infested, freezing, winterous summer, doing nothing but paint the Thousand Suns with very slowly separating metallic paint, I'm very excited with the way the Thousand Sun army is going at the moment.
Oh my God, I'm surprised that actually didn't drive you into warp-fueled depths of insanity, quite frankly. I'm surprised you didn't start seeing Zechian visions everywhere.
Well, I did for a while, but the thing is, my friend Dave and I, who I was on this holiday with, have now bonded in this strange kind of Stockholm situation, sympathy with our captors, in that we're both quite fond of the Thousand Suns now.
Yeah, absolutely. The Thousand Suns saved my sanity. That's the title of the episode. There we go. Brilliance. Love it. But have you seen the more recent miniatures?
They're absolutely gorgeous.
Oh my goodness! It's so bizarre, isn't it? Adam and I have discussed it on previous episodes, but the Thousand Suns are historically one of the most neglected armies in all of 40k. They've never had a complete miniatures range, and I mean never. Not even way back in the depths of the realms of chaos days in Rogue Trader. Even back then, they didn't have a complete miniatures range. Second Ed, they had no miniatures at all. Not a one. You had to convert everything. Or just use the old miniatures. And it wasn't in all of the editions that have followed. They haven't really had a dedicated miniatures set. I think they had one miniature set in 3.5, in 40k 3.5, and they were okay. For the time, they were absolutely fine. But all they were conversion kits for the main Chaos Space Marine set. They just had, like, metal fronts for the plastic miniatures that had the tabards on them and the metal Thousand Suns heads with the Egyptian head crest.
Yeah, and this is, really tragic because they have the best fluff.
Yes! Oh, they so do! They're one of those legions, the Thousand Suns, for me, that I go back to them again and again, and I actually reread their story quite a lot, because I think it is one of the best stories in all of 40k. It's got everything. It's got sort of like the tragic fall from grace. It's got massively attractive and sympathetic anti-heroes in the form of Magnus and Ahriman. And it's one of those wonderful stories that throws a rather unflattering light and a degree of ambiguity on the quote-unquote good guys of the setting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's got pathos, it's got drama, and it's been novelised and narrativized so fantastically well by Games Workshop and the Black Library over the last... it's probably coming up for about 10 years now.
Yeah, absolutely. The Thousand Suns books are some of the best ones. There's no doubt. They've actually done the Thousand Suns real justice. I think it's Graham McNeil who wrote those ones, isn't it?
Yes, who is an exceptionally good author.
He is. He's one of the Black Library's strongest authors, actually. There are two people in the Black Library who do the Thousand Suns really well. There's Graham McNeil and John French. Graham McNeil does the Horus Heresy era Thousand Suns beautifully. John French does the present-day Thousand Suns beautifully. So if you get those two together, you're gonna get a good story. I just love the way they're characterized, and a lot of that background that they established has informed the way that the Thousand Suns have been resurrected in the present day 40k. So there's a lot of background that they established for the first time in their book series that now not only inform the present day background of the Thousand Suns, but also their rules.
Yeah, and I think that's incredibly good joined-up thinking. I'm looking at my bookshelf at the moment, and there's quite a bit of John French on there.
Good. There should be, because he is very good indeed. He's his Ahriman series, for example, absolute brilliance. I mean, it is one of my favourite series from the Black Library, full stop. And once again, you get this wonderful thing where Ahriman, yes, he's an awful guy in many respects. He's arrogant and manipulative and is very willing to sacrifice pretty much anyone and anything for his agendas. However, there is this core of humanity to him. His core motivation, the thing that's driving him, is he wants his legion back. He wants his brothers back. And it's such a noble agenda when you look at the rest of the Chaos Space, quote unquote, the Chaos Space Marines. It's such a noble agenda that you can't help but thinking, you know what, I hope you do.
Yeah, his story is one of loss, of exile, and it's faintly moving in a way that a story about a mortal sorcerer really probably shouldn't be.
Oh, absolutely, and I just love the fact that you really get a sense of that as well. I mean, the time frame that we're talking about here is insane. It's very difficult to capture in any narrative sense because, of course, you have to imagine it. It's not something you can refer to experience on. This guy is 10,000 years old. He's been wandering around the warp for 10,000 years and is at the beginning of that book series is broken. Totally broken guy. He doesn't even call himself Ahriman anymore. He calls himself something like Hawksos or something like that, which means failure or shamed one or no one in old Prosperine. He is absolutely broken and also terrified. Absolutely terrified of his own powers, of his own capacities, because he believes that it's those powers that led his legion to damnation. It's a wonderful tension. He is a Chaos Space Marine who is not a Chaos Space Marine, in the sense that he doesn't worship Tzeentch like most of his legion does. He hates Tzeentch. He hates the warp. He hates chaos. He uses it as a tool because he doesn't have anything else. He doesn't know how to do anything else. but he despises it, and everything he does, every sacrifice he makes, every genocide he enacts, it's to tear his legion away from its clutches.
I find Chaos Space Marines in general to be distressingly psychologically normal compared to Loyalist Space Marines.
To the Loyalists, yes. This is something I've really noticed with the Black Library books. They go out of their way to present a contrast to the way the background is generally presented in the books, in the codices and whatnot. In the codices, obviously, they present a much broader, more simplified version where the Chaos Space Marines are all fanatical lunatics and monsters and warp-fueled mutants. Whereas if you read, for example, Aaron Dembski-Bowden's Abaddon books, which are all about Abaddon the Despoiler, it's just not that at all. They aren't that. They are not what is presented in the general background. Abaddon, for example, is not. He is not this raging arch-messiah of darkness. He is not that guy. In those books, he comes across as this shamanistic character. He never asked for the mantle that he wears as the sort of arch-champion or the arch-messiah of the dark gods. That's not what he's trying to do at all. Again, it's about this. It's about honor. It's about fraternity. When he creates the Black Legion at the beginning of those books, in a book called The Talon of Horus, it isn't about creating an army to wage war on the Imperium. It's about a new zeitgeist, because, of course, from his perspectives, it's failed. Everything has failed. The Imperium, the Emperor, Horus's rebellion, Horus's ideology, the Primarchs, everything has failed. The creation of the Black Legion is about creating an army which is without Primarch, which is without history, which is without past. Every member of the Black Legion, which is derived from lots of different legions, by the way, not just the Sons of Horus, it's about rejecting their past and creating something new. It's about a new fraternity. And do you know, they don't call him my lord or master or anything like that. They call him brother. And he insists on that.
I suspect that one way or another, all of the Chaos Space Marine traitors who are narrativized in the Black Library are basically failed idealists. They're people who are actually trying to hold on to something which is good in a fundamentally horrific universe.
That's absolutely true, you know. And, you know, that is the funny thing, isn't it? If you look at them, and certainly the way they're characterized in the Horus Heresy books, it's always their ideals that leads them down the path of darkness. They are always the more human of the Primarchs. If you read the books about Lorgar, for example, the First Heretic by Aaron Dembski-Bowden and Aurelian, which is a beautiful book, by the way, he's one of the most sympathetic Primarchs, without a shadow of a doubt. And he's right. That's the worst of it. He's absolutely correct. The books go out of their way to demonstrate that he's correct. Chaos is the fundamental metaphysics of this universe. It is the ultimate truth that he was seeking. And he doesn't necessarily like it. He's not some exultant fundamentalist, which is how he's presented in the general background. He's actually a considered metaphysician who wants the gods to operate on his terms, not on theirs. And the way he talks to them, the way he interacts with them is fantastic. He actually tells them their business a lot of the time. There's a scene in Aurelian where he actually goes into the Eye of Terror on his own. It's almost like a pilgrimage. It's like a shamanistic quest. And the reason he's doing it is because he wants to be sure that these powers that are talking to him are worth his time. He doesn't doubt that they're divine. He doesn't doubt that they're powerful, metaphysical entities. But he wants them to be worth his legion's time and their passion and their faith. And he ends up on this maiden world, on this it's a crone world rather, which is it's an ex-Eldar world that was pulled into the Eye of Terror. And he ends up fighting a bloodthirster that Khorne sends as a kind of test for him. And he ends up absolutely demolishing this bloodthirster. Which is a feat even for a Primarch. And what he says to it, as it's dissolving, its physical form is dissolving, he says, the Blood God is going to have to do a lot better than that to win my faith. I love that. I absolutely love that. Go back to the Blood God and tell him he's going to have to do a lot better than that. It's wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah, the Black Library is full of questing individuals, and I find the characterization in them be kind of remarkably psychologically astute. I think the entire idea of the Chaos Gods is, in and of itself, absolutely fascinating, because they are both projections of and fuels of the human psyche, and therefore are all dominant and through all things. I think they're absolutely remarkable.
They are. I mean, what I like about the Chaos Gods is they, in terms of their metaphysics, they are, three of them, at least for me, they meet the criteria for being legitimately divine, which Zeech, Nurgle, and Slanesh all meet the criteria for being legitimately divine, in the sense that they are immortal. They're not perfect by any... They're not perfect entities. They are not like, say, how monotheistic divinities tend to be presented in their particular religious ideologies or mythologies. They are not that at all. They are, as you say, reflections of consistent human or sentient drives and passions, and in that regard they are legitimately divine. I absolutely love that. I love that. And they are the divinity that exists in this reality. There isn't anything else. There's no other choice. They are going to win. Eventually. They are going to win. And at the very least, I mean, it's a nihilistic universe, the Warhammer 40,000 universe. There's nothing good in it. There's no hope in it whatsoever. You may as well throw your lot in with them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is probably one of the most nihilistic and bleak universes imaginable, outside of, I don't know, H.P. Lovecraft or Cormac McCarthy, something like that. It probably deserved to sit on the shelf between those two authors' collective works, so it is astonishingly bleak.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know that were I to materialise in the Warhammer 40,000 universe at some point, then I would have no hesitation in throwing my lot in with Slanesh, because at the very least Slanesh offers some hope. I mean, your only real option in that regard, okay, you're either going to end up degenerating into a mindless spawn, which is the most likely option, or you have ascension in infernal glory and passion and desire and pleasure forever. It's worth the risk. In that universe, it's worth the risk, because there is nothing else. What other choice are you going to have? To die or be lobotomized on some hideous imperial world where you're going to be an indentured slave for the rest of your existence, and then you're going to die.
Yeah, humanity comes off absolutely terribly in all of the Warhammer fiction. I mean, I'd rather be a Tau if I was given an option.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. Or maybe an Eldar on one of the craft worlds, perhaps. At least they have society, they have structure, and they do other things other than toil, suffer, and wage war. They have art, they have craft, they have musicians, they have performances and whatnot. I could totally see the pleasure or the joy in living as an Eldar, they're not the Eldar anymore. They're not. I do apologise, Games Workshop. The Eldari. I do apologise. Yes, that's one of the many rebrandings that's occurred of late. They're not the Eldar anymore, because of course Eldar is a word that derives from J.R. Tolkien's works. They're now the Eldari, and you have the two sub-factions of the Eldari. You have the Azhuyani, who are the Craft World Eldari, sorry, and you have the Drukhari, who are the Dark Elder.
I saw you do quotation marks around it. Yeah, you flecked your fingers in quotation marks when you did that, I'm sure. So
furiously. Absolutely furiously, yes. But that said, I mean, I actually rather like that rebranding, I've got to say. I mean, the Eldar is a lovely word, and I will hold it in my heart forever, because the Eldar were my first army. They were the thing that really attracted me to 40k. But I like the Eldari rebranding, and the way they've gotten around it is rather clever as well. The Eldar thing derives from a misunderstanding from when humans first came into contact with them. That's what they thought they were called, so that's what they called them, but that's not what they call themselves. So that's the in-law justification for that.
Works for me. Absolutely works for me.
Me too, me too. By the way, Tom, if you do get any of the more recent codexes, in fact, get them all. They are all stunning.
They're beautifully illustrated. They're a nice thing to hold and kind of tut over late at night, aren't they?
Absolutely. But what gets me about them, as I've discussed with Adam on previous episodes, they are all good. Every single one of them, and we've never had that before. We've never actually had an edition of 40k in particular where every codex is a winner.
And that's good, because I remember playing, and this is about 10 years ago, where one had to buy the latest codex with its appendant army, otherwise you just wouldn't win.
Yes, yes, I remember that in the days of Second Ed when I first started. The hobby, actually, the latest codex was always the killer codex, basically, and the reason being they never had any standardized format back then. So the codexes were these wild, idiosyncratic things where each book was a power unto itself. Utterly ridiculous. I remember, for example, when the Tyrannid Codex first hit, the Second Ed Tyrannid Codex, they were beasts back then.
Oh yeah, absolutely. They were virtually unstoppable, and I've got a dear friend of mine who's recently stopped being a Tyrannid player who got into it at that point because they were myriad and virtually unstoppable, and also, I've got to say, absolutely wonderful in how they were narrativized and the explanation by what they were. It was brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. I mean, that was really my first exposure to the Tyrannids. They'd gone away for a long time since their original iterations, like you only had the Warriors and the Gene Stealers back then. But that explosion, it really did flesh out their background enormously and made them feel like this real science fiction threat. It's what I like about the Tyranids in contrast to, say, Chaos. Chaos, which is always going to be my love in these universes. Chaos is metaphysical and very human. I hesitate to use the word evil because I don't actually think it is evil within these universes, but for the sake of brevity, it's a metaphysical evil, it's a metaphysical corruption, whereas the Tyranids are very science fiction and beyond morality. They're sort of an amoral, very, very alien threat, which is something, it's just a wonderful contrast.
It's like the black mould in your student bathroom come to life and then spreading over the galaxy, so there's a very primal sense of connection to the horror they're describing,
Yeah, I mean, once again, the new Tyrannid Codex is an absolute winner, and this is like the Thousand Suns, like the Chaos Space Marines. It's a codex that really does. They've tried to undo the last 5 or 6 years of the Tyranids because they've just never been very good since Second Ed. To be honest, they've always struggled. For some reason, they've never been able to get them working in a codex since those times, which is a real shame because the miniatures are a million times better than they used to be. Obviously, the miniatures are absolutely stunning, but they've never been able to get the army to work on the tabletop properly. But now they're absolutely wonderful. Absolutely wonderful, and the new codex, it goes so far in trying to flesh out how they work and what they're actually doing in the current iteration of the universe. This is another thing that the codexes do so well. They're trying to move the armies on, just as they've moved on the general background, So now you've got things like the Demon Primarchs wandering around again. You've got Magnus the Red actually as a miniature. You've got Mortarion actually as a miniature. You've got one of the Imperial Primarchs. You've got Robert Gilman wandering around as the regent of the Imperium. Emperor and all that name.
The Supply Emperor, yeah.
Yes, Supply Emperor. Yes, that's exactly what he is. And as a result, all the students are playing up.
Well, I think there's an interesting lesson we can get from the Warhammer story in that things which idolise the past and look backwards are always prone to stagnation. And I think that's the description of the Imperium always got. That if you constantly look back to a vaunted and completely inaccurate past, your future's going to be terrible.
That's a really weird and bizarrely fitting metaphor, isn't it? Because that was the place, like a lot of hobbies and fandoms, that's where Games Workshop was about 5 years ago. It was far too sort of navel-gazing, it was far too obsessed with its own past. But since then, it seems to have realized as a company what these universes need to make them dynamic again, which is movement. It needs change. So very dramatic change in certain instances. I mean, moving on from 40k, have you seen what's going on in the fantasy battle recently?
Absolutely, yes. And I, having not played for a couple of years, I spent a wonderful evening, thanks to the gentleman of 4chan, updating me on what the situation was. I mean, some of their language is colourful, and I think they've made a hate cathedral of a couple of people. But I think it's fantastic. And also, I think it's necessary because the reason you invited me on tonight is because I'm a second-generation Warhammer player. And so I grew up with an incredibly static empire, which until a couple of years ago had never changed. Warhammer Fantasy had not moved 1 inch, and it kind of saps the life out of its own material after a while.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the biggest. I mean, it wasn't as true of the 40k universe, but it was getting there. But the fantasy, but like the old world, what they call the world that was now, which they refer to obliquely, had not changed for the longest time. The reason being, it was way more contained than the 40k universe, because there was a map and there were definite areas and definite histories. There wasn't very much you could do with it without fundamentally altering the status quo, which they seem to be quite afraid of for the longest time. You know, you were having these narrative campaigns that were purportedly having these massive, sweeping, enormous events, but nothing was actually happening.
Oh yeah, and the universe descends into hyperbole, isn't it? Because everything is always the end times, everything is always subject to the winds of chaos, and then the winds of chaos blow over and, you know, barely a twig is disturbed upon the ground.
Absolutely. That's the big problem. That is the big problem. But then you got, when I started to really get back into the hobby, you had the end times, which was this enormous event, which they went out of their way to basically rip up the map of the old world. You had things like Nagash being resurrected, which was the best thing ever, by the way, because I don't know whether you've listened to any of the previous episodes, but Adam and I absolutely gush over Nagash. A lot. We are Nagash fanboys. We absolutely love Nagash. And since his new have you seen the new miniature?
Absolutely gorgeous.
Oh, God, he's so good. He's so good. But since his resurrection, everything has changed. Everything has changed. I mean, the old world is gone. It's been obliterated in this metaphysical apocalypse. And the result is this wonderful new state. Now, when AOS first hit and we had this entirely new status quo, there was a lot of negativity. There was a lot of doubt, from the old guard and whatnot. People didn't really know how to take it, and it did take a while to find its feet. But we've recently had the second edition of Age of Sigmar. And I tell you what, Tom, get that book. Get the big core book for Age of Sigmar 2.0, because it is absolutely spectacular. What it's done is all of they did have this tendency to just throw everything at the wall to see what would stick in terms of ideas with early AOS. So it was very difficult to get a bead on what was actually happening, what the status quo of these new realms were, or how they functioned even. What they've done with the new book, they've absolutely solidified everything. So we get maps of the new realms, which are all based on the Winds of Magic that were. So you have their metaphysical realms. They have this kind of Roger Dean prog rock album cover thing going.
Yes, album cover, which is fantastic. Yeah.
It's so cool, isn't it? It's so wonderful. They're all metaphysical, so they're all kind of abstract. And you've got, like, the lands and the worlds shift and change depending on, like, the whims of their creators. Lots of the classic characters from Fantasy Battle have become vessels for the Winds of Magic that were, and have therefore become gods. They've become divine. So you have Alariel, for example, the old Wood Elf Queen, who is now the vessel for the Wind of Life, and has become Alariel, the goddess of life, who is now a counterpoint to Nagash and to the Chaos Gods. It's not, the metaphysics has moved on massively, so now it's not just the Chaos Gods. The Chaos Gods are one pantheon in a metaphysics of potentially infinite pantheons. You have Nagash, who is obviously the god of all death now. Part of the background I adore is that after the destruction of the world that was, Nagash ferreted his way into basically all of the afterlives that ever were, barring the ones that the Chaos Gods rule over, and devoured all of the gods of death from every mythology you could possibly name, and became the uber god of all death. That's just wonderful, isn't it?
It's absolutely fantastic. It's gorgeous. It's also kind of necessary as well, just to move on. Warhammer Fantasy Battle from where it was is
absolutely, and it's big, isn't it? What I've noticed is they've made it huge in terms of its ideas. So you have these enormous events happening. I mean, recently you actually had this very bizarre thing happening where Nagash he unleashed the winds of death from his realm in Sheesh, and they have spread throughout the mortal realms and have fundamentally altered how the mortal realms work. Now that is apparently a dynamic that it's what Games Workshop are doing with the universes that they've created now. They've realised their mistake. They've realised that the static nature the status quo that the universe is operated under over the last 10 years really just haven't worked. They've led to stagnation. So what they're doing now, they've made them dynamic universes. So every so often, every year or so, there's going to be a campaign or an event that fundamentally alters the shape of the mortal realms and of the 40k universe.
Yeah, and I think that's exciting gaming because you're playing in something which is live and active, and it means that you're constantly doing good storytelling as well. And the interesting thing, I'm very familiar with Warhammer 40k fiction at the moment, but not Warhammer Fantasy Battle fiction, which I don't know where that's at the moment.
Well, at the moment, I mean, I wasn't a big fan of the Fantasy Battle fiction when it was set in the old world. I wasn't really that bothered about it. I liked some of it. I liked anything involving Nagash, and I liked anything involving the vampires or any stuff like that. I was quite interested in that. But by and large, the setting just didn't thrill me as such. It just wasn't that interesting to me. The stuff set in AOS in the mortal realms is just fascinating. Just the settings alone, the descriptions of cities in the realm of fire, for example, just wonderful, because the cities are proper high fantasy nonsense, stuff that shouldn't work but that does, like giant citadels made of lava. It's mental. It's absolutely crazy, and I love it. Zeichan cities, right? Zeichan cities where currency is ideas or experiences or emotions. It's these abstract concepts that just I love. I love in all of literature, not just Warhammer-based literature. So to have that in Warhammer is wonderful to me.
It's good. It's necessary. See, I grew up in a time where Warhammer and Citadel miniatures, as they were there, is that the fluff was almost so much more exciting than the miniatures themselves. So I'm tremendously fond of tabletop gaming as a way of being able to tell good narrative.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is actually, as we were discussing off air earlier, this is something we ask each of our guests, and I realise we've gone on a massive tangent there, as it does tend to happen. That as our viewers, our listeners know, that's our nature. It's the way the Fluffenhammer is. We waffle, and we deviate, and we go off on our own tangents. That's what makes it fun. It's why you listen. We know it is. But one of the things we ask all of our guests is, when did you and how did you originally get into the hobby?
Right. Well, I was born into it.
Oh, you mentioned earlier you're a second generation Warhammer fan, and this is one of the many reasons we wanted you on. We've never had that before.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, my dad was an absolutely massive early adopter of Games Workshop and White Dwarf in the early 1980s. He got there from Dungeons and Dragons. I'll tell you more about that. But I grew up in a house which was full of goblins and back issues of White Dwarf.
That now I know I said earlier that we had the title for the episode. I grew up in a house of goblins might be the title.
It's about right. I mean, it was part of a larger sci-fi thing. I don't think many kids had William Gibson and Roger Zelazny read to them as bedtime stories, but
probably not. Wow, the dreams you must have had. My God.
Astonishing. The bill for therapy I had as an adult was also especially high.
I don't doubt it. But yeah, this led into your warhammering, yeah?
This did, because it's like, a fish recognising the existence of water. It's a great indicator of what your parents are like is when you go into their garage and see what is in there, be it car parts, golf clubs. For me, it was a copy of the board game version of Dungeons & Dragons, not Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which had been carefully taken to pieces and then remounted on something like a 3-foot by 6-foot, 3-dimensional board, which was about 3 foot tall and wrapped around each other with entire caves and dungeon systems made around it to emphasise the board and the moving around the board.
That sounds fantastic. That sounds wonderful.
It was in the centre of my garage underneath a massive, heavy 1970s-esque green curtain, but that's just the thin end of the wedge.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, so, what do you do when you can't sleep at night and it's Christmas Eve? Well, some children, I don't know, you watch TV, you read. I went through my dad's back issues of White Dwarf.
Oh my! So he must have come in right at the very beginning, I'd assume.
He had a copy of White Dwarf issue 1, which is probably impossible to come by nowadays.
I've been trying. Both Adam and I actually, we've both been trying to put together collections of classic White Dwarf for sentiment's sake, largely. Those early issues, before it was exclusively Games Workshop products, when they used to cover pretty much everything from D&D to Call of Cthulhu to Cyberpunk 2000 AD, pretty much everything. They're very difficult to get a hold of, and to get a hold of them in good nick, nigh impossible.
I think there's a wonderful putting things into PDF project for someone with a lot of time on their hands who wants to create like a digital back issue archive with the blessing of Games Workshop, because it's priceless. I have in my hands while I'm talking an issue of White Dwarf number 69.
Oh, wow.
Which lists, it has in it a Call of Cthulhu supplement and an AD&D scenario.
That is awesome. Absolutely awesome. I mean, this was way back in the Ian Livingstone days of Games Workshop, I'd assume.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And if you care to cast your mind over the back, your eye over the back issues, you will see lots of advertisements for very early kind of play-by-phone, play-by-mail, and play-by-bulletin board (BBS) system dial-up adventures based on Ian Livingstone's Fighting Fantasy books.
Oh my god, that is fantastic. I love the fact. I wonder if anyone actually ever did that, because it is such a clunky way of doing it, isn't it? It must have been hell on earth to organise that kind of thing. Hell on earth. But I wonder if anyone ever did it consistently and did it successfully.
I would be absolutely fascinated, because one of the great things about growing up in a Warhammer household is the reliance mostly on mail order. And so your life is a constant cycle of expectation and excitement. Waiting, first of all, you order something and you're not quite sure what it's going to look like or if it was well described to begin with. And then the wonder of, is it going to arrive this week?
Yeah. Every time the mailman comes down the road, you just, the excitement.
It formed either virtue or psychosis, and I'm not quite sure which.
Oh, that is fabulous. So what parts of Games Workshop, like what armies and whatnot were you and your dad into?
My dad has always been a goblin player, and so at the time this was chariots and wolf riders.
Brilliance. Oh, so really his that's the style of goblin army that still exists and has existed since those days. So he would have been all right.
Yeah, absolutely. I dare say, the metal, and this was metal back in those days, has still been around. It'd still be perfectly fieldable today, and they were absolutely gorgeous and fantastic. I mean, for those who are possibly born, this millennium rather than last millennium, I mean, a lot of Games Workshop Citadel miniatures from the time required a great deal of imagination and effort, so that you could fully envisage what they were.
Yes, I mean, anything that sort of had, anytime they tried to do something vaguely human looking, didn't work.
My first painting experience ever was with some plastic wood elves who were stood sideways on diagonal slaughter bases, square bases, and were devoid of all facial features and were all holding the same stringless bow.
Yeah, I remember those guys. God, that was a real dark time for Warhammer, wasn't it? It was when they discovered plastic, which was good, but it was when all of the plastic miniatures were just exact copies of one another.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the only thing more depressing with the plastic was attempting to drill and pin together a multi-part metal model. For example, a dragon.
Oh my, I do remember those days. I remember them very well. I'm having visions of Egrim Van Horstman on Baldros, the big double-headed Chaos Dragon, which was one of the first really big miniatures I put together and painted, of it falling in half over and over and over again.
Watch them disassemble themselves in real time, despite all of the pinning and drilling and their forms of concrete cement in their polystyrene. And it would just slowly expand and fall downwards over the table like a gently flowing lava.
Of course, obliterating all of the detail on your expensive metal miniature.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the only other thing worse, I think, than the Wood Elves and the Dragons was the original Gene Stealers, of which I still have a spectacular scar in one of my thumbs when I was attempting to mod one and trying to cut one of the arms off.
Oh dear. Oh dearie me, yes. Oh man, I mean, the hardcore converters from back then, I mean, my goodness, they had some chops about them. They really did, because it was an effort back then. It really was. Trying to saw those metal miniatures, trying to saw off arms or saw them in half or whatever, you needed some time and you needed some safety equipment to do that.
Yeah, I suspect that anyone who won a Golden Demon in the 1980s became a very famous architect or surgeon as a result of their experience, because those guys must have been astonishingly talented.
Absolutely. They must have been like Michelangelo-style sculptors or savants of that degree in order to do it. Yeah. But then again, I mean, I remember having some of the White Dwarfs from way back then when I was a kid, and some of the ones that did feature the White Dwarf entries, they were spectacular. They really were, like heavily converted stuff. It must have taken some degree of effort.
Absolutely astonishing. I mean, I imagine a lot of people must come to the hobby from, the model railway community or something, where that kind of the obsessive, slow building of detail is incredibly laudable and normative. But it's for me as a very young child, it was like the inside of White Dwarf magazine contained pages of magic when it had photos of what people could do with this stuff.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I remember, when you first get into it, when you first see the painting, it feels impossible, doesn't it? When you first see the miniatures, not just the ones that are in White Dwarf, but just other gamers have painted, you're like, how on earth did they do that? When you look at your first miniatures, which have basically all the detail has been obliterated by big globs of paint. But then something just clicks, doesn't it? After you've been doing it for a while and you realise that there is technique here and that you can do it. It's not that difficult once you've learned how to do it, once that you've had your eureka moment.
Absolutely. My eureka moment was I admit absolute moral failure at this point, but my eureka moment was marrying someone who was a better painter than I was.
That's brilliant.
The early years of my marriage was sitting watching the X-Files on VHS from the beginning, while my wife did a far better job with my dwarf army than I ever did.
That is superb.
I think it's admitting long-term defeat on the project, but it kept me painting for a number more years.
Oh, that is brilliant. So not only a second generation Warhammer fan, but also your armies are sort of joint ventures.
Yeah, very much so, very much so. I mean, we really came together in those difficult first years of marriage over dwarves.
Brilliant.
Battle of the Skull Pass era dwarves. There we go.
Wow, my goodness. Well, once again, I mean, the dwarves are your thing, are they, Tom? Are they one of your sort of main interests in the game?
Absolutely adore dwarves, and I adore Grey Knights.
Wow, okay. So, of course, the dwarfs aren't called the dwarfs anymore.
No, but, they cannot be copyrighted in the simple form dwarf.
No, they are the Duarden now. And they're not one race anymore. There are lots of different types of dwarf now. So you have the Fire Slayer style dwarfs, which are now an entire race unto themselves. And they're like fire elementals, so some of the miniatures are sort of combusting. Their beards and their wild hair, it's actually made of fire. And that's because I think it was Grungni, one of the dwarf characters from way back when. He became the vessel for the Wind of Fire. So he's now actually the god of fire.
And this is all desperately needed as someone who's historically played dwarf, because the dwarf army tended towards sameness very, very quickly, and so diversity is greatly appreciated.
Well, if you look at, like, when I first came into the hobby, which was sort of around 2nd Ed 40k, I think it was around 3rd Ed Fantasy Battle, the dwarfs did not change from that point right up until the end times. The structure of the army didn't change, the basic units didn't change, the way they played didn't change. They were basically the steampunk army.
Yeah, absolutely. From this earliest possible iteration, it was steampunk. And I say one thing I distinctly mourn the lack of in Warhammer 40k was the Dispirant of Squats.
Ah, yes. But they've come back. They've come back. They released a squat miniature for one of, I think it was for Necromunda. The new version of Necromunda. They released a squat miniature for it, and an Imperial Beastman. A non-Chaos Aligned Beastman, which was another thing that went away for the longest time. But you also have, now in AOS, have you seen the Caradron Overlords? You've not seen them? The Caradron Overlords are the other dwarf race, basically, and they've gone hyper steampunk with them. I mean, like, to the nth degree. You can't even see any flesh on them. They're completely encased in this steampunk armor. Even their beards are encased in this steampunk armor, and they fly. They have the AOS fantasy steampunk equivalent of jetpacks, basically, and they fly. They've even got top hats and monocles that are technology, and they fly around in these huge airships. Enormous zeppelins and whatnot. They are spectacular. And I mean, I was never really interested in the dwarfs as they were in Fantasy Battle. They were just not my army. The Caradron Overlords, if I had the money and I had the time, I would collect an army of them in a heartbeat, because they are beautiful. They are absolutely beautiful, and they bring such a different aesthetic to the game.
Quite something to have that, because I was thinking about what's my primary relationship with Games Workshop, what keeps me going, and I worked out it's the exact opposite of my relationship to Star Wars. You see, I've been I've been given narrow eyes by people who are staring at me in suspicion when I say I'm not that interested in the latest Star Wars films. And that's because I worked out that my primary relationship with Star Wars was with the 1970s and 80s Kenner toys.
Ah, yes.
Why I love Star Wars, and the media leaves me cold. But my primary relationship with Games Workshop is actually, it's not through the plastic, but it's through the fluff. It's through White Dwarf magazine, and it's through the Black Library.
I think it's funny, but the amount of people we have on for whom that is the case. Of course, we have had alternative perspectives on as well. I mean, we had a gentleman on a little while back, and he's really into the tactile elements. He's into like the mechanics, the plastic, the converting and all of that kind of thing, and the casting even. That's his thing with it. The vast majority of people, myself included, it has to be the background. It absolutely has to be the background, the characters, the aesthetics, that kind of thing. It's why I'm not that interested in other game systems, to be honest, because they just do not have that degree of connection for me.
Well, and the connection is incredibly long-going, because I remember reading early Games Workshop fiction. I don't even know if it was branded Black Library at that point.
It probably wasn't back then.
And let me know, but reading compendiums like Wolf Riders, which is stories mostly about goblins, and then some of the really early Space Marine-based fiction. Around kind of Deathwing, that kind of, which was absolutely, which stay with me. And what's kept me in the orbit of Games Workshop over the years, because I've moved around a lot, it's been the storytelling rather than the product itself.
I mean, I've no doubt that were it not for, say, the efflorescence of Black Library and the work that began to come out of that publishing house with, say, the Horus Heresy series, I imagine a lot of us would have fallen out of Games Workshop much more permanently. I've no doubt that this podcast probably wouldn't be happening were it not for that. Because the gaming system, the miniatures can fluctuate wildly, as it has, and that can determine whether you're part of that particular phenomena or not, whether you're buying the miniatures, whether you're playing the game or whatever. But the fluff, the background, it's been so consistently interesting. Even, I mean, don't get me wrong, not everything from the Black Library is amazing. There's a lot of pretty bad stuff from it, but the good stuff is very good and has served to elaborate the universe in such wonderful ways. In ways none of us would have expected, that it's kept us there, even through the really dark days of the actual gaming system.
Well, about 15 years ago, I was living in Canada. The local branch of the Toronto Public Library system I walked into, and it had, at that point, pretty much everything in the Black Library on a shelf, which was astonishing. There was a librarian there with some very specific budgetary goals, and had a huge amount of Dan Abnett, who I picked up, and I read most of his excellent stuff because it was there. In Toronto, and Torontonian winters are incredibly harsh. You don't go out much, so you get a lot of reading done.
Yes, of course.
And it kept me in the orbit of the hobby, because I could do two things. I could either go to the library and check out the latest Dan Abnett for free, or I could take the 40-minute freezing cold journey into the centre of Toronto to the one Games Workshop in the really scary, weird mall, and spend a lot of money I had, and probably just bring a box home because I had nothing left to paint it with in my house. So, I think the fluff does marvels.
And of all the ones you could have been latching onto, Dan Abnett is probably one of the strongest, to be honest. He really kick-started it with Horus Rising, which was the first book of the Horus Heresy series, which was an absolute astonishment to me, I have to say. I remember first getting it, I picked up that and False Gods, the follow-up, both together. And I think I read Horus Rising and then read it again immediately after, because it did such strange and unusual things with these archetypes that I presume to know. Such deviant things, in fact, like Horus painting him as a good guy, as a decent individual, who laughs, who smiles, who loves his sons,
Really, whose betrayal is simply foreseeing the future as it is and trying to stop it with the decayed horror of the Imperium.
And ironically bringing it about, becoming the cipher that brings it about. It's the layers of tragedy that it adds into the story. I love it. I think it makes not just the traitor legions, but also the Imperium itself and all the Imperial legions so much more interesting. A very good example are the Ultramarines. The Ultramarines, just not interested. I just was not interested in them at all. before the Horus Heresy books. They were the Blue Space Marines, they were the Vanilla Legion. I had no interest in them whatsoever. Reading Unremembered Empire, which I believe is by Dan Abnett, which is about Robert Gilman and what he's doing in the midst of the Horus Heresy. Love them. Absolutely love them. And I really like him. Of all the Loyalist Primarchs, he's my favourite.
Yeah, having read that, I would say that it's because the Ultramarines were the faction that I wouldn't playing Space Crusade as a kid. So,
Yes.
they had nothing interesting. I mean, the Imperial Fists were down the line, the Blood Angels were probably vampires, but the Ultramarines had absolutely nothing going for them.
No.
And to give them a point of interest, and actually to make it an attractive point of interest, a shining beacon of hope and decency and morality and order in the middle of the Imperium is good going. It's good going.
Absolutely. I mean, the Ultramarines, they are the shining beacon of hope, it seems to me. In all of the gothic insanity, the fundamentalist zealotry of the Imperium, the xenophobia, the superstition, the worship of very questionable things, the Ultramarines seem to be a shining beacon of classical civilization, of philosophy, of art, of culture. They could be the seeds of a genuine human empire, in the classical sense, as the Emperor purportedly intended. Even now they could be that, because Gilman is that. That's still what he wants. That's still what he believes in, despite everything, despite what the Imperium has actually become. And what that does in the present-day Imperium is it layers in this wonderful sense of tension between the Ultramarines, their Primarch, and the Imperium at large.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting tension because I think without humanizing, there is a tendency in Warhammer 40,000 fiction for everything to become nihilism for 14-year-olds. It becomes very stereotype heavy metal album cover kind of generation. I
hesitate to use the term, but there's an emo quality to it, isn't there? There is a sort of self-harming to Nirvana feeling about it all.
So it's interestingly having a very strong memory of going into the Croydon branch of Games Workshop in the 1980s, and on one wall that you'd have Space Hulk and Deathwing and Gene Stealer mounted in very, very big racks because these were big boxed objects, and next to it would be the albums by D-Rock.
Oh my goodness! Oh no!
It was very probably what people's grandparents think heavy metal music is all about music. Apologies to any members of D-Rock who may be listening, because actually it was pretty interesting stuff when you were a kid.
When you're a kid, absolutely. I mean, the very notion that there was music produced around Games Workshop, around that time as well.
Say, do it, to Games Workshop person, do it again, reform D-Rock, and let's have a reunion tour.
Because absolutely. Let's have some World Eater. Let's have some Bolt Thrower and whatnot. Why not?
Absolutely, but there is a tendency for the fiction to go that way. I think it's been parodied as grimdark.
Yeah, it really is. It's that very over-the-top darkness, isn't it? That very sort of over-earnest that can very easily fall into the realm of self-parody.
Yes, absolutely. This is kind of why I really got into Dan Abnett's writing probably about 15 years ago. Is because it showed sparks of humanity and decency and common sense and the small stories of people doing right things in hard circumstances, which was a wonderful antidote to that.
Absolutely. And what people tend to forget these days is it's now just commonly accepted that the Imperium has become the opposite of what the Emperor intended. The Emperor intended this very secular, this rigorously secular scientific utopia, essentially. However, that was not the case before the Horus Heresy books. That notion was never mooted, ever, in any of the background books. For all we knew, the theocracy that it became is exactly what he intended.
Absolutely. And the idea that what we have is corruption and failure and decay from rather than a move towards.
Yeah. It just, again, it's this layering in of extra themes, of extra layers of interpretation, and of tragedy. It lends the whole universe this sumptuous air of tragedy that humanity has, largely thanks to the Emperor's efforts, it seems, become exactly what he purportedly did not intend it to be.
Absolutely, yeah. None of this was meant to happen, and I think it's a wonderful warning to anyone who you or I who may want to call themselves a geek who tends to look at the past with a very rose-coloured glasses. It is that there's a warning that actually the things which are static and the things which are backward-looking invariably just fail and disappoint.
They stagnate, absolutely. And of course you start to realise they're just not as good as what your nostalgia proclaims. Nostalgia is such a distorting influence. It's something, again, it's one of our pet subjects on this podcast, because we really are about looking forward to the new stuff. We are not really about looking back as such. Certainly not looking back in that very, I hesitate to use the term, but that fanboyish way, which it does pervade a lot of fandoms, like the Doctor Who fandom, for example, like the Star Wars fandom, like the 1980s cartoon fandom, where there is this tendency for people to idealise what they absorbed in their childhoods and not to look at it with any great degree of objectivity. So, for example, I mean, within the realms of Games Workshop, I've got a soft spot for the 1980s stuff. I really do. I love all of that sort of very earnest, very naive stuff, the artwork that wasn't quite there yet, where they hadn't really established their style, the background, which isn't brilliantly written but has got a lot of passion behind it, and the miniatures, which were great at the time because they were the first ones that we ever saw, but which are not very good. But objectively speaking, if you go back and look at those things that were your linchpins, your introductions to the hobby, with a critical eye, outside of affection and sentiment, they're just not very good compared to what's around now.
And that's absolutely right. I think there's one thing I might call it the Stranger Things 1980s nostalgia, which kind of looks back to the past and sees it as this inexhaustible fount of creativity, joy, and human overflowing, and actually forgets that growing up in the UK in the 1980s was actually fairly grim.
Yes, it was a dire place.
Many of us embraced fantasy and science fiction as kids in the 1980s because we were living in actually a fairly grim, quite seemingly hopeless world growing up.
Fairly dystopian situation, yeah. It may be slightly difficult for our younger listeners to appreciate, but that was legitimately the case. I mean, it was a state of total deprivation and of mass unemployment, of protests in the street, of societal crackdowns and violence against the poor,
Yeah, absolutely, and also it wasn't the political, utopia. I mean, that we do not enjoy today, but may well, because I remember stuff. For example, here's a good example. We weren't allowed to watch one episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation in the UK because it had parallels to contemporary political situations, and the British government thought it was negative. And therefore, watching all of Star Trek: Next Generation, there was one episode that we never saw growing up because it was considered to be politically subversive.
Well, so much was censored back then. I mean, this is another thing. This was in the height of the video nasty scare. So you had literally films being banned left, right, and centre. You had the BBFC just obliterating the arts. I mean, completely riding roughshod over the arts and dictating what people could and could not watch, what they could and could not consume, which of course, ironically, as it always does, led to an efflorescence of these materials because people wanted to know what the fuss was about.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to advertise something, ban it.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a very create furor around it. Get someone protesting it or something. You will get immediate free advertising. But in that regard, it's a wonder that Games Workshop, given how lurid and violent and disturbing some of the stuff in those early books was, like the early Realms of Chaos books, it's a surprise it really didn't cause more uproar than it did.
I was thinking about this in preparation for this recording. I was wondering how socially acceptable, the Games Workshop Dungeons and Dragons fantasy and sci-fi scene was to mainstream culture in the 1980s. And I have a feeling it must have been something that was a bit closeted and a bit underground.
Maybe that's it. Maybe, because of course we forget back then, it was actually much more difficult to be aware of things because there wasn't the internet. Nowadays, of course, if there's something, if there is a phenomena, if there's a culture or community, you largely know about it, even if it is niche, even if it is unusual. Like, a very good example is the furry fandom. You know about the furry fandom? That's a very good example. Now, way back in the 1980s, the furry fandom would have been... most people would have not even had a clue what that was about. Now it's almost mainstream. It's something that people just know about it. Even if they're not part of it, they know about it. They may know someone who is part of it, It is that kind of thing. I imagine back then, part of the reason why Games Workshop wasn't caught up in the general societal crackdown on material that was considered subversive was because people just didn't know what it was.
I think so. Because Games Workshop had a public presence, right? It's a publicly listed company, I think, at the time. It had branches, going to the branch in Croydon, and there were, smaller independent hobby stores that I'm very fond of. But it wasn't mainstream. In the same way, computer gaming wasn't mainstream. It was a very small niche hobby which existed through print publications, hence why the existence of White Dwarf is to advertise the wares of Games Workshop, because there was no other way of communicating this material.
Oh, absolutely. It was such a communal thing back then. It was such a communal entity because it couldn't be anything else. There was just no way.
I remember doing my gaming on big boards in the kind of the lower class end of church halls at inconvenient times when nobody else had wanted to rent them. But it was communal. It was supported. It's the era of the stapled magazines and the send a self-addressed envelope for our catalogue.
Yes! Oh, yes, I remember so well filling in those order forms at the end of every White Dwarf and probably not sending any of them off. It was just a wish list. Yes, exactly what it was. It was a wish list. Because I had none of my own money back then, because I was a child. Oh, but yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And were it to have come to the attention of the likes of, say, the Mary Whitehouse Brigade, I imagine there are certain elements that would have had massive protests outside of the Games Workshop stores. Things like Slaanesh, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. The ideas that which were disturbing. There's a huge body horror aspect to the Chaos Gods, which I think in the 1980s would have been confined to video nasties, and if you were more highbrow, the works of Clive Barker.
Absolutely, yes, or Cronenberg or someone to that effect. Yeah. But as you say, it just wasn't mainstream back then. It certainly swelled to become much more widespread since that time, and largely again thanks to the internet. But it's still not mainstream, and it never will be.
No, that's right. It's odd to think that when they tried films based on comic books and similar intellectual properties in the 1980s, they absolutely bombed. I'm thinking of the He-Man movie and Howard the Duck as two particular, absolute colossal failures, one which crashed a studio. And nowadays you can have Marvel being the staple of every summer blockbuster.
Yep.
The question of how acceptable was this? It was probably cleverly censored. I remember that one of Tom Hanks's early films was a moral panic movie about the dangers of Dungeons and Dragons.
Mazes and Monsters. Yeah, I remember very well. Yeah, because that's another thing. It wasn't so much a thing here in the UK in the 1980s because D&D was almost non-existent. It really was. It was such a small community back then. It was much more of an American phenomenon because it is, of course, the home of D&D. But there was this massive scapegoating movement from certain fundamentalist quarters back then against D&D. where they were calling D&D satanic, they were calling D&D some like a sort of psychologically subversive thing that was somehow corrupting the minds and the souls of American youth.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think interesting that they're onto something. Drum roll before I am burnt and pillaged. In that, actually, I think that good sci-fi and fantasy holds up a very subversive and uncomfortable mirror to our own society.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, and in that regard, that may have actually been, because I do tend to analyse these movements on psychological terms, and I never believe them. I never believe the moral cant. It's never about, oh, let's think of the children. It's never about that. It's always a reaction to something much more unconscious, and that may be it. It may be the fact that it was counterculture, that it was subversive, that it was introducing children and young people to new ideas, to alternative ideas. Looking at it from a fundamentalist perspective, for example, from the perspective of, say, a very conservative, ideologically certain household, in D&D, what do you have? You have a universe that's multicultural by its very nature, because you not only have various race of human moving around, you also have elves and lizard people and goblins and dwarfs, all with their own cultures and their own ideologies and their own beliefs. You have colleges of magic, you have lots of different gods wandering around, and actual gods. They exist. It's not like a matter of belief in the D&D universe. Not only do these gods exist, you can prove they exist, because priests of Timora can do miracles that are directly from Timora. Gods are priestesses of Lolth can cast dark miracles of Lolth, and so on and so forth. So that in and of itself, that very notion must have come across as terribly, terribly corrosive and subversive to those households.
Yes, absolutely. I'm reminding our younger listeners that the 1980s was actually pretty racist.
Yeah.
Politically, very, very conservative and controlling. And very rigidly bound in a very strange class structure, which is completely incomprehensible to outsiders.
Yeah, absolutely. It was its own hermetically sealed little decade, wasn't it, the 1980s? People have enormous nostalgia for it, if they were children growing up, because of the media of the time, but it wasn't as good as you remember. It just wasn't.
And because as children we were shielded from the worst horrors and excesses of the age. And I think when we look back too fondly on the past, we tend to excuse a media which was created in very difficult and trying circumstances.
Absolutely. And by and large, most of the media aimed at children back then was, of course, designed to sell them product.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, how much you and I may love Transformers. The Transformers cartoons are there to sell plastic, changeable robots.
Absolutely, that's all they are. They're not there to tell a story. And for whatever sentiment we may have of those stories, because of course they were largely our first. I mean, I was born in 1984, so I've never known a world without things like the Transformers or Games Workshop or whatever. I've never known a world without them. But there's no denying that the original Transformers cartoon is, from an objective perspective, not very good. It's not very well made. It's not very well written. It's terribly animated. Some of the voice acting is okay, but it exists not to tell me a story. It exists to sell me product. And Games Workshop is an unusual phenomena in that regard, because although, yes, it is designed to sell me product, the 1980s stuff, if you read the Realms of Chaos books, for example, it's very clear the people writing that work have incredible enthusiasm for what they're doing, because it's the first time it was set down. They're being allowed to let their imaginations run wild. The same is true of the artwork, because there's no real house style at this time. The artwork is so surreal, it's so strange, and there's just such a variety of tone and of style back then. It's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that has been, looking back on my life, this kind of exposure to this chaotic mess of different ideas all filtering together through one company, it's actually been very formative.
Yeah, I mean, this is another thing we tend to like to ask our guests. I mean, what kind of influence has the Games Workshop material had on things like, say, your imagination and the way you perceive the world?
Okay, well, this is a statement which I can guarantee that nobody has said on your podcast, and probably nobody has said before, that I think Dan Abnett made me an Anglican.
Wow. Stop giving me so many good titles, Tom. I don't know what to call this episode now. Dan Abnett made me an Anglican. You know, if Adam was here, that would be the title. That is such an Adam title for the episode. That would be the one.
I'll have to explain is that I was reading a lot of Dan Abnett, I said about 15 years ago in Toronto, and at the same time, as you do as a slightly younger man, working out what you're doing with your life. And I was really struck by the moral compass in some of Dan Abnett's work. I'm thinking of Eisenhorn and Ravener in particular, in which, the Inquisitors are not moral paragons.
Not exactly.
Fine monomaniacs. But actually, some of the people that he has in inquisitorial warbands are real human beings who are caught up in an unjust world, and some who try and champion and make that world better.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
It's interesting because I was reading that at the same time as, funnily enough, reading the Book of Common Prayer, which is not a common bedside, combination of reading material.
Not at all. The contrast is absolutely wonderful. I love it.
What I love is that both have a rhythm, and there's a meter for the imaginative and the Gothic and the Baroque. Which is actually tremendously informative. I mean, I'm a vicar in the Church of England, and I've got to say that probably early exposure to Battlefleet Gothic and everything that is full of massive, Gothic architecture, cathedrals, and ecclesiarchy is probably somewhere in my current chosen profession.
Yeah, so there is actually a kind of aesthetic overlap, isn't there, that I never would have considered before. But yes, of course. Of course there is.
Can't be a space marine, but it can be a vicar.
Yeah. Oh man, I mean, you can. I know you cannot be a space marine yet. I mean, let's see how it goes. Wow, yes. I mean, beyond the obvious ideological influences, because of course there is a heavy Abrahamic influence in the aesthetics and the mythologies of the 40k universe in particular, more so in fact than there is in the stuff from Fantasy Battle, way more. Given that, yes, I can see where there is an actual overlap in your life, in what you've dedicated yourself to.
It's been very, very positive. I mean, there's something wonderful about being able to game with a dog collar on. And I'll tell you one story where it had an interesting result. Is I was at a tournament for hold on a second. What was I playing? I was playing Inquisitor. There we go.
Oh, the old Inquisitor game.
And I was playing it at Games Workshop. I decided to go in my dog collar because I could. It was also I think it was the Easter weekend. And I wanted to think if anyone spotted me, they wouldn't think I was bunking off work.
Brilliant.
I happened to know somebody working at Warhammer World at the time, and I thought I kind of knock and say hi. And they were happily working in the stockroom or something. So I went up to someone and I said, "Excuse me, would you mind awfully getting the name of my friend? I'd love to be able to chat to him." And the poor chap who I conveyed the message to got the wrong end of the stick and went entirely pale and slightly glassy-eyed and ran off into the back reaches of Warhammer World, presuming because a priest in a dog collar had come, I was there to break some news of some phenomenal personal tragedy.
Okay. And all you wanted to do.
All I wanted to say hi, but the chap I wanted to speak to was delivered in front of me at a run within about 30 seconds of my initial request, at which point I had to backpedal profusely and say that everything was fine.
Well, I imagine this is a byproduct in part of you being quite unique. I can't imagine there are many Anglican vicars who play the Games Workshop stuff. I mean, I may be wrong. I may be totally wrong, but I can't imagine it's a common phenomenon.
There are a lot of geeks in the Church of England, but it depends what you're geeky about.
It depends on the type of geek, doesn't it,
Yeah, I think so. Funny enough, there are a fair number of geeks in ministries throughout a number of churches in the UK, and I've met some, but I think my own particular geekiness is formed by my exposure to Games Workshop in the 1980s, and so you're going to have to do a lot of Venn diagrams to get, sci-fi Games Workshop geek background and currently working as a vicar to.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of real overlap going on here. It's almost like a cross-section of your psyche or your soul that we're getting through this episode. It's really quite cool.
It feels wonderfully cathartic. I think that there's something about if you have exposure to sci-fi and fantasy and the idea of other different worlds and reality being expansive and multifaceted. And I think that actually propels you towards some very interesting things and makes very interesting choices. But I think ultimately it equips you with a huge amount to be optimistic about.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me as well, the fact that we have this wonderful, it's a slightly hippie-ish phrase, but this wonderful coming together of people from lots of different diverse backgrounds, all of whom have some connection to this material and find meaning in it somehow. Yourself, from your Anglicanism, I know for a fact that even in the Fluffenhammer, in this small subsection of the community, we have pagans. There's one gentleman who is Catholic. There's myself. I consider myself an agnostic atheist with occult leanings. It's wonderful, isn't it, that we find some degree of poetry and commonality in this, in what is ostensibly just a frivolous thing, just a hobby, but also something that actually provides a framework for meaningful conversation.
Yes, absolutely. It's the power of narrative and the importance of shared experiences, because geeking is something that's never really done on one's own.
No. It really can't be, can it? I think when it is done on one's own is when it becomes obsessive and dangerous. It's when you tend to get that very particular kind of, for want of a better, geek who seems to feel that they own the franchise, that it belongs to them and that it should speak to them exclusively. I mean, we're having a similar thing in Doctor Who at the moment, obviously, because of course we have the first female Doctor, which is ruffling a lot of feathers. The sort of He-Man Woman Haters Club division of the Doctor Who fandom, which I know I should have more patience for, perhaps, but don't. It is a case of, guys, go and get laid, please. Or just talk to some women, please. For God's sake, please just talk to women as people.
Yeah, absolutely. It's everything that geeks are pilloried for, but few geeks actually possess. The kind of the stereotype of men on their own bashing their keyboards in frustrated rage.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's a subdivision that you have to take into account because they are very much there, and they do tend to have very strong, or at least very strident voices within these communities. There is obviously a similar thing here in the Games Workshop and Warhammer communities. If you dare to dip toe into some other communities, there's a lot of unpleasantness out there. Things like, for example, reactions against the Adeptus Sororitas, for example, the Sisters of Battle, who are, by the way, getting a resurrection in 2019.
They kind of need it, because I think
they haven't had a dedicated army list since Second Ed.
I thought it had been a bit of a while, but
it's been a while. Yes, they've been away for a long, long time.
You see, I think it's good. I think Games Workshop is far more balanced than other systems for having the inclusion of female characters, but that's not historically the case. They're getting better at it now.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? Now, if you like, I mean, in the fiction, for example, one of the interesting things about the universes, not necessarily the game systems or the miniatures ranges, but the universes are phenomenally liberal. In the Horus Heresy books, for example, within the Imperium that was, there are same-sex couples, there are polyamorous couples and cultures. There are, I mean, obviously, racial divisions mean absolutely bugger all.
Well, yeah, I mean,
I
because
mean,
space marines, qua space marines, they come in literally all forms of skin tones.
oh, absolutely. When you've got like green aliens running around, when you've got what the heck do divisions in humanity matter? What you would very quickly, when you've got humanity scattered across the stars and you've got races of human beings evolving separately in different star systems that, like, because of the particular radiation from those stars, have semi-translucent skin, or like the human beings of Nocturne, for example, where the salamanders come from, that have this like coal black, almost burnt skin with red eyes. It's like, why would you care? You have such diverse cultures that are all part of the Imperium. What really matters to the Imperium is humanity as a whole. The diversity doesn't matter at all.
And I think actually that's an important and good message for our time. Like what I said earlier about sci-fi being an uncomfortable mirror, it can also be a comforting and aspirational mirror.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and then you have, what I like as well is you have the extremes of that, because of course you have, say, the powers of chaos. So let's look at, say, Slanesh worshippers, where there is total license, where nothing matters, where there are absolutely no parameters, and in fact transgression is the sacred artifact. So it provides a framework for the absolute extreme for you to explore and look at that and how that works out too. It's a very clever way of looking at things. And I love that. I love the fact that something that's ostensibly a hobby allows us to have very profound and important discussions.
And I think it's good. I think that's really important. I say it's really important. I say this other thing as a geek who is now raising the next generation of geeks.
Absolutely, yes.
That's something which is not only aspirational and positive, but allows people to explore what their own future geeking might be about. It's great. I mean, I've had Games Workshop has brought out some really wonderful, nice, little, smaller games. Now, the one that's the successor to Mordheim, whose name I can't remember, that comes in a box with wonderful little pre-made small armies of about 5 miniatures. What's that one? Because I played.
Oh yes. It's not Shadespire, but Shadespire is pretty much like the more recent evolution of Mordheim, essentially. It's pretty much the same system. But I know the system you mean, I just can't remember what it's called off the top of my head.
I was recently beaten at that by a 9-year-old girl who loved it to bits and was an astonishingly good tactician while playing it.
Isn't that so cool?
Great that there is a new generation coming in who are male, female, diverse, and they can get into it and be accepted and own it as something which is theirs in the way that we did.
Brilliance. That is wonderful. I mean, it is not a case anymore of have you got a list, love, which would have been the automatic reaction to a woman entering the Games Workshop, wouldn't it? At one time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It was the dominion of the men who really needed a date.
Pretty much, yeah, pretty damn much. Now it's becoming massively diverse. I mean, this is another thing as well. I mean, we have yourself with your being a second generation Anglican Warhammer fan. You have myself, a gay man, in the community. It's wonderful. That's another thing I've never actually explored very much. Are there many LGBTQ people in this community?
I don't know. I mean, I identify as bi, but I don't really go and ask people, if I happen to be in a Warhammer environment. Hi, what are your sexual preferences?
No, I don't either. I mean, but it is, isn't it? You did an icebreaker first. Unless you're a Slanesh player. If you're a Slanesh player, you can ask what you like. Absolutely, you can ask whatever you want. But it would interest me. It interests me in the same way, like, not terribly long ago, I used to be a much bigger part of the Transformers collecting community. And what has consistently surprised me about that community is there's a huge LGBTQ presence. And I mean absolutely huge. It's a very diverse and sort of fluid community. And I wonder if the same is true of the Warhammer community.
I think that would be fantastic to ask other people and ask around if anyone's listening and wanted to input on that. I think.
Oh, absolutely. Answers in the comments, please. I'm well up for that. And I am up for doing a much longer discussion about that, actually. Please, answers in the comments or on the Facebook page. How do you define, ladies and gents, and all variations thereof? How do you define? And, does that have any impact upon your gaming or on the types of armies that you select, do you think? I mean, I've noticed my penchant is to go for very aesthetically pleasing armies. So, Slaanesh, Tzeentch, Eldar. I wonder if that is the queer in me coming out a little bit.
I have absolutely no idea. I genuinely don't know, but I think it's fantastic that there is a hobby which is so diverse and inclusive that people can enter it, engage it, and be comfortable entering it and engaging it as who they are. Because I think that's part of the role of fantasy and storytelling in our culture.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, there's this very myopic and very prescribed notion that fantasy fiction or any kind of speculative fiction is somehow escapist. And that is just simply not true. It's not true of what would be considered, say, the most escapist fiction, like the sort of Tolkien-esque fantasy. It's simply not true. Even if you look at something like Tolkien, there are all of these reflections and allegories and moral considerations that reflect our own reality,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what draws me back to Games Workshop in all of its forms, be it tabletop, be it fictional, be it computer games, which we haven't touched on. But
no, of course, that's a whole other bag of fish, that one.
I've done 20 years of those. Absolutely. I can trace my lineage back to Shadow of the Horned Rat and beyond.
Bloody hell. So a long way back.
To the 80s, because I'm playing the computer adaptations of Hero Quest and Space Crusade.
Oh, the C64 and Commodore Amiga ones.
Absolutely, yeah. I had them on the Atari ST, and I correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the version of Space Crusade originally released was bugged and was unplayable.
I believe it probably was. Yes, that would not surprise me in the least. And back in the days when patches were very, very, very hard to come by. I remember that very well. I used to enjoy the Space Crusade an enormous amount. Until the computer played the Soul Stealer card.
That was I think my appreciation of how random and unfair the life is probably because of that particular Soul Stealer, not a Gene Stealer. I have no idea. Maybe there were copyright issues.
I've no idea for that, but they actually not only changed the name, but they slightly changed the look of them as well. They were slightly different from the way the Gene Stealers looked in the box.
Tentacle and more scythy of the arm.
Yes, yeah, way more scythy. So maybe they were afraid of some like HR Giga sort of copyrightery or something. Because they did look a lot like the alien back then.
H.R. Giga was known to lawyer up on occasions, so...
Yes, and not without cause.
Well, no, he had a great deal to do that. And it's funny enough, it's amazing that in its nascent days that Games Workshop was not sued to pieces by...
Oh, by everyone, basically, because almost everything in their IP is derived from something else. Almost everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's one wonderful example, and we can't do this. Fyodor Dostoevsky has been dead about 150 years, but there is a wonderful Inquisitor Karamazov.
Karamazov, yes, there certainly is.
Stupidly metatextual reference, because in the Brothers Karamazov, there is that one of the brothers tell the story about the Grand Inquisitor. So, yes. I mean, somebody is showing off their degree in English literature quite heavily.
Well, it's like the Dark Angels, isn't it? I mean, they're named after a poem called Dark Angel by a poet called Lionel Johnson.
That I did not know. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and in fact, more or less the entire character of the Dark Angels is encapsulated in that poem. So, yes, all the secrets of the Dark Angels, ladies and gents, revealed to you.
available as free PDF download. Yep, fantastic.
Certainly so. So is there anything? Are you actually actively in the hobby now, Tom? Are you actually painting up anything, or are you creating anything, or do you have intention of creating anything?
I think because of life changing, and this is what I love about the Games Workshop franchise. I've gone time wise beyond what I can do on the table for a couple of years. I now have 2 young children, and that's really the prep time required to actually play a game of Warhammer now would be completely beyond my abilities. And so where I've gone is I've gone towards its electronic medium, which is absolutely fantastic nowadays. Anything from the adaptation of More Time, which is on the PlayStation 4, to any of the Dawn of War franchise.
Which is very good.
Brilliant, and there's a lot of coming out on Steam and elsewhere of adaptations of Inquisitor, of Space Hulk. There's which is absolutely it's wonderful. It's live and it's engaging.
It's wonderful, isn't it? And it's a lovely way of Games Workshop hooking new fans, from other demographics, from the game playing demographics. I mean, anyone who's attracted to those games aesthetically and in terms of their technicalities will probably find some satisfaction or meaning in the tabletop games too.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, they're infinitely adaptable. Coming from the era of great box games, so Space Crusade and Hero Quest, Space Hulk being my example. My primary experience of Games Workshop is through the boxed product, which is in toto all you need to play the game. While I've had great fun with both Warhammer Fantasy Battle and Warhammer 40k over the years, collecting and painting armies, and I've filled more rooms of more houses with plastic than I care to publicly admit. I think now, in my current stage of life, I love that it's a hobby that I can take with me in an electronic and book form and still feel as attached to it as I did while fretting over the eyebrows of a dwarf.
That is superb. Absolutely superb. Again, it's slightly unusual because most of the people we've had on are sort of actively into the modelling and painting and whatnot, but you found a slightly different evolution, as it were. I mean, not to tempt you or anything like that, but you do know Games Workshop now are re-releasing new versions of all of those wonderful boxed games that are all self-contained.
I am terribly, terribly aware, and it's absolutely wonderful. You see, I can get so much of my model geeking done second-hand through a collection of geek friends who I can go to their houses, stand in their garages and go, ooh, at all of their wonderful stuff, without having to deal with the wrathful gazes of their spouses as they wonder where the garage has gone and why the credit card bill is so high.
Yes.
It's wonderful, and I always, at some point, intend to get back into that, but probably through the gateway drugs of the boxed games.
I think it's a good way to go. I mean, the current vogue is a new one coming out, which is Rogue Trader. It's actually called Rogue Trader, Rogue Trader Kill Team. So it's like it's a very small scale game. It's like skirmish level 40k, where you have maybe one squad and a character from your army, and you're doing something like invading a space Hulk or suppressing an uprising on an imperial world or something like that, or playing as a chaos cult or a gene stealer cult for that matter. And it's very small scale, very mission oriented, so very narrative, and very easy to pick up and play. It looks absolutely brilliant. That's the one that everybody's geeking out over at the moment.
That sounds absolutely wonderful, because I am familiar with Rogue Trader before it was Warhammer 40k. A game so complex it had to be played with a games master.
I know, right? It's still incoming from tabletop role playing back then, isn't it? Which it still very much resembles.
Yeah, and anything that can evoke the, let's face it, mad spirit of that.
Yes.
Because I have this wonderful childhood memory of sitting in McDonald's in Red Hill with the brand new issue of Games Workshop on my hands, which had an orc army list. And just the sheer mad, failed, inventive technology of the orcs with squeak brain transplants and the like. And anything that brings back that level of colour and interest
craziness
is wonderful.
It's like the Die 100 tables of chaos mutations in the Realms of Chaos books.
How many of those ended with you just being a puddle of something?
Yeah, a lot, I imagine. Quite a lot. That was the most common end for most Chaos models, I imagine. And it's like the most ridiculous stuff, from like hybridized with die 100 tables of various animals, including things like spiders and maggots, to funny walks. One of the mutations is called Funny Walk. It's just wonderful. Right, thank you. I mean, that was superb, Tom. That was absolutely superb. I think since we are running towards the 2-hour mark now, we can draw it to a close at that point.
Well, thank you very much. I make it 1 hour and 40 minutes on my count, and it's been a pleasure to be there for every minute. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. This has been a fantastic episode. I cannot wait to get it edited up and to have it up there. I think this one's going to go down very, very well. My apologies to Adam. I wish you were here, man. I wish you were here for this one. It would have been such a good discussion. But Tom, would you be willing to come back on and chat with Adam as well?
Absolutely delighted.
Fabulous, because I know he would love to have a chat with you when everything's sorted. He would love to, when he's recohered his material form.
I wish him all the best in those efforts. They can be very tricky.
It can, can't it? Especially if, like him, you are touched by Zeech. So, it's entirely random as to what he's going to end up with.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a struggle for so many of us in the mornings to find where we put our shoes and car keys, let alone our head and internal organs.
Exactly, yeah. As we've discussed before in this podcast, when you are a Chaos entity, buying the correct shoes and clothes and whatnot it's a perfect nightmare.
You usually end up in the Kagul end of the market for clothing because there's so many things you can cram into one.
Exactly, but that's not a good look for anyone, even a hideous abomination from beyond the stars.
And I wish him all the best in his rematerialization.
Fabulous stuff. Well, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, sans Adam, and hopefully we will all be back very, very soon indeed. Thank you so much Tom for coming on. Is there anything you'd like to pimp out, by the way, Tom? Is there any project or anything that you'd like to mention?
Not at this current time, actually, funnily enough. I wish all of the listeners to this podcast happy geeking in whatever form it takes.
Fabulous. As per usual, you can find me at strangeplaygrounds.com. You can find my fiction there and lots of different articles and reviews and rantings about things. You can find my YouTube channel at exaggeratedelegy.com, and you can also find me at enigmaticelegy on Twitter. Until then, ladies and gentlemen, bye-bye!